There's no explosion, no screaming, no warning. A man doesn't lose his masculinity in one loud moment. He loses it in silence. Small, ordinary choices that feel harmless, until one day they add up to a stranger in the mirror, like Zeno's ship, plank by plank replaced. He looks the same from a distance. He functions. He provides. He endures. But the man who once stood with quiet fire is gone. And the saddest part, no one notices. Not even him. It begins with reasons that seem noble, keeping the peace, being the bigger person, giving her time, staying for the kids. At first, it feels like love. Then, it starts to feel like sacrifice. Eventually, it just feels empty. That's how emotional erosion works. It doesn't shatter you. It sands you down. Each tolerated disrespect. Each moment you bite your tongue when your soul is screaming. Each fake smile. Another plank pulled from your foundation. Chrysippus once asked, if a man lives the habits of his past but his direction is lost, is he still the same man? That's the paradox. You show up, you smile, you pay the bills, but inside, something is fading, and the world keeps applauding your functionality while your essence slips through the cracks. Masculine energy isn't aggression, it's not volume, it's not control, it's the quiet weight of structure, the presence of stillness, the discipline of conviction, the sacred refusal to shrink. It's the ability to say no without needing permission, and the power to leave without causing harm. Masculinity, at its core, is not about force, it's about form. And when that form bends too many times, it stops returning. This isn't about sounding strong. It's about remembering what you were before you began negotiating with silence, before your boundaries turned into begging, before your truth became something you edited for approval. It's time to ask, which parts of you did you replace to survive? And was the survival even yours? Because resilience isn't always a virtue. Sometimes it's a disguise. Sometimes it's how we justify becoming unrecognizable. This isn't about shame. It's about recognition. It's about standing where you are and admitting, quietly, firmly, I've lost pieces of myself, but I can find them again. You weren't weak. You adapted. You weren't broken. You bent to hold the people you loved, but bending too long turns into breaking, internally, silently, permanently, unless you stop. This video isn't about fixing you. It's about showing you what was taken, what was given away without a fight, what you still have time to reclaim. Because the ship isn't gone, it's scattered. The structure can return. The man can return. But first, you have to stop pretending nothing's changed. Let's begin. It never looks like surrender in the beginning. It looks like kindness, cooperation, patience. A man's first compromise often feels like love, until it becomes habit. The first plank is rarely dramatic. It's the quiet moment when your yes no longer comes from choice, but from fear. Fear of conflict, fear of her mood, fear of losing what little peace is left. So you agree, you nod. You soften your tone, not because you want to, but because you're tired. Because saying no feels like starting a war. That's where it begins. The erosion of masculine integrity, not in grand betrayals, but in these small agreements that betray your truth. You tell yourself it's not worth the fight. You convince yourself you're being the stable one, the rational one, but inside, you start shrinking. Because every time you say yes when your gut says no, you teach your nervous system to abandon itself. There's a part of the brain that kicks in under long-term emotional suppression, the limbic system. It overrides logic. It prioritizes survival. You stop acting from presence. You start reacting from preservation. It's not weakness, it's adaptation. But over time, that adaptation becomes your new identity. You're no longer leading, you're managing. You're no longer expressing, you're appeasing. And slowly, your boundaries dissolve under the mask of being easy to live with. She may not even notice, not at first, but your energy changes. You're no longer rooted, no longer weighted. Your presence becomes cautious, predictable, hollow. And then comes the moment that breaks something sacred. Not because it's loud, but because it confirms the silence inside you. You realize your yes doesn't mean anything anymore. Not to her, not to you. There was a man who once said yes to everything. Every dinner, every demand, every conversation that made him disappear a little more. Until one day, someone looked right through him. Not because they hated him, but because he had made himself invisible. That's what this kind of compliance does. It trains the world to stop checking in with your soul. because you've made it clear you'll go along. This isn't about rebellion. It's about return. The return to choice, to center, to the quiet, powerful conviction that your yes means something again because you earned the right to say no. Most men don't realize when it starts. They just know that at some point, the room stopped feeling like theirs, not because someone told them to leave, but because they started folding themselves into spaces that no longer recognize their voice. This is how it happens. You trade your truth for emotional safety, not because you're weak, but because your nervous system remembers what it feels like to be punished for being honest. It's not conscious. You start small. You laugh at the jokes that bruise your soul. You stay in roles that make your shoulders tense. You avoid mirrors, not because you don't like your reflection, but because it reminds you of everything you've stopped saying. Every unspoken truth becomes another brick in the wall between who you are and who you pretend to be. And the longer you keep it up, the easier it becomes to live as a version of yourself that keeps the peace, at the cost of your presence. Presence isn't about being in the room. It's about being felt. A man who speaks from his core changes the atmosphere, not with volume, but with conviction. But when he masks that core to survive emotionally, something begins to die. It doesn't scream, it doesn't bleed, it just grows quiet, like a fire that no longer fights to stay lit. Neuroscience tells us that our identity is shaped by mirroring, how we respond to others and how they respond to us. Mirror neurons reflect who we think we are through what we receive. When your environment only accepts your performance, not your truth, you slowly forget what real feels like. That's why so many men feel invisible, because emotionally they've already disappeared. Masculine energy doesn't vanish. It retreats. It hides behind politeness, behind endurance, behind smiles that say, "I'm fine," while the soul tightens. But hiding too long turns into rot, not because you're failing, but because you're no longer honest. Not with her, not with them, not with yourself. You were never meant to be silent. You were meant to speak with your presence, even when you say nothing. You were meant to take up space, not apologize for needing it. The moment you begin to censor your existence just to keep someone comfortable, you begin to forget the sound of your own voice. And that's when you start losing yourself, not with a scream, but with a nod. She didn't stop desiring you because you lost your edge. She stopped feeling you because your presence lost its weight. What most men misunderstand is that masculine energy isn't about performance, it's about gravity. It's not about what you do in the bedroom, or how much you provide, or how well you argue. It's about the force beneath your silence, the conviction behind your gaze, the boundary in your stillness. And when you start bending your internal compass to match her emotional weather, something sacred begins to shift. You stop being the anchor. You become the barometer. You begin adjusting, soothing, explaining, until the clarity of your energy becomes diluted. And she feels it, not consciously, but deeply. A woman senses when your silence no longer comes from strength, but from fear. When your calm is not rooted in power, but in avoidance. When she says, "I miss the old you," she's not talking about your hobbies or how spontaneous you used to be. She's talking about the man who once chose when to speak and when to hold his silence, because both came from clarity, not confusion. She's talking about the man who didn't seek permission to be still, who didn't explain himself every time her mood shifted, the man who could feel her storm and still stand on dry ground. Feminine intuition doesn't respond to logic, it responds to energy. And when that energy becomes inconsistent, uncertain, malleable, it loses its authority. Not the kind that controls, but the kind that grounds. Women don't want men who dominate. They want men who do not vanish under pressure, who do not question their value every time they are not validated. Stoic philosophy teaches this without shouting. What you tolerate teaches others your price. If you bend every time love threatens to leave, you're not offering presence, you're offering compromise. And slowly, she stops trusting what you say, because your silence, once sacred, now feels like surrender. She didn't stop feeling you because you changed. She stopped feeling you because you stopped showing up from your center. And without center, nothing you say, no matter how kind, how passionate, how loving, can be felt as truth. Because it no longer comes from you. It comes from fear of losing her. But a man who fears losing her more than losing himself has already lost. There's a shift, almost invisible, almost silent, a moment where a man begins to apologize, not for mistakes, but for his presence. He doesn't even realize it at first. It starts with over-explaining. with softening his voice in rooms that used to respect his silence, with asking if it's okay to feel what he feels, to want what he wants, to need what he needs. You think you're being thoughtful, considerate, a good man, but what you're really doing is asking for permission to exist. You're placing your worth in someone else's comfort, and that's how you begin to disappear. Not because someone erased you, but because you stopped showing up as if you belonged. This usually comes after abandonment, not the kind where someone leaves, but the kind where you're still there, yet you feel alone, emotionally starved, spiritually dismissed. So you try harder, you give more, you lower your voice, your standards, your boundaries. You want to be chosen, so you make yourself easier to keep, and in doing so, you become someone you wouldn't even choose yourself. Masculine strength is not the absence of emotion. It's standing in your truth without shrinking. It's saying, "This is what I feel," and not flinching when that truth makes others uncomfortable. It's holding your ground, not to dominate, but to remain whole. Epictetus said it simply, if someone treats you as nothing, it's because you've shown them you're replaceable. That truth stings, not because it accuses, but because it reveals. You didn't become nothing in her eyes all at once. You did it slowly, through quiet permissions, through lowered standards, through asking to be accepted instead of standing in your own acceptance. You thought you were being peaceful, but what you were really offering was a version of yourself edited down for approval. And that's not peace, that's performative silence. That's the kind of stillness that doesn't calm, it suffocates. There is a dignity in not apologizing for who you are, in walking into a room without needing to prove your worth, in loving without begging, giving without pleading, existing without shame. The man you were born to be doesn't need validation to stand. He only needs one thing, to remember he was never meant to ask for permission, only to show up, fully, and remain. Some of the deepest wounds wear the mask of virtue, and none is more deceptive than misplaced loyalty. As boys, many of us were taught that loyalty makes a man, that staying through hardship is honorable, that endurance is strength. But no one told us that staying too long, in silence, in disrespect, in emotional starvation, becomes self-betrayal. It looks noble from the outside. A man who refuses to leave, who keeps the family together, who swallows his pain to be reliable. But inside, something is bleeding. Slowly, quietly, without anyone knowing. Loyalty, when given to the wrong place, drains you. Not all at once, not with noise, but like a leaking pipe under the floorboard. Until one day, you look around and realize everything's soaked in resentment. There was a father. He stayed in a dead relationship for the kids, told himself it was the right thing, told himself sacrifice was love. But what he didn't see was the damage that silence did. His sons learned that men should endure pain without boundary. His daughters learned not to trust men who smile while suffering. That's the legacy of loyalty without self-respect. It teaches the next generation to abandon themselves in the name of duty. Masculine energy isn't about staying. It's about knowing where you stand. It's not stubbornness, it's direction. A man without direction doesn't stay because he believes. He stays because he's afraid. Afraid to be alone, afraid to be judged, afraid that leaving means failure. But the real failure, staying where you are no longer respected, staying when your soul has already walked out. You have to ask yourself, who are you really loyal to? Her, or the scared version of you that believes suffering earns love? That believes disappearing earns peace? Loyalty is sacred, but when you give it to what drains you, it becomes a weapon turned inward, a slow suicide dressed as sacrifice. You are not weak for leaving. You are not selfish for protecting your peace. You are only lost when you forget that your loyalty means nothing if it costs you your soul. Comfort never announces itself as the enemy. It wears the face of logic, of reason, of being the mature one. You tell yourself you're choosing peace, that you're avoiding unnecessary conflict, that you're just being adaptable. But deep down, you know the truth. You've stopped negotiating with life. You've started surrendering, one quiet smile at a time. This is how masculine identity collapses, not in one dramatic event, but through the soft erosion of conviction. You begin to let things slide. You stop calling out what doesn't sit right. You tell yourself you're being flexible, understanding, emotionally intelligent. But what's really happening is that your fire is cooling, not because it burned out, but because you stopped feeding it. The mind is wired for adaptation. Neuroplasticity doesn't care about your dignity. It rewires your brain to fit the patterns you choose most often. So when you avoid friction long enough, when you repeatedly step back instead of forward, stay silent instead of speak, nod instead of stand still, your brain learns a new pattern: passivity, not peace, not calm, just numbness, just quiet compliance wrapped in the word reasonable. Masculine energy demands friction, not chaos, not violence, but resistance, tension, the edge between what is and what must be spoken. A man without friction is not a man at peace. He's a man slowly dying behind a smile. He stops challenging the world not because he trusts it, but because he no longer trusts himself to withstand what comes with speaking up. You don't feel empty because you're broken. You feel empty because you've stopped honoring what your soul keeps whispering. You've stopped standing when it's time to stand. You've traded conviction for convenience. You've convinced yourself that quiet is strength. But it's not the silence of power. It's the silence of collapse. Real peace isn't found in avoidance. It's found in alignment, in the ability to live in truth, even when it costs you comfort. Especially when it costs you comfort. Because a man who's too comfortable to confront what's killing him isn't living. He's fading. With a smile no one questions. There's a turning point in a man's life that no one else hears. No big speech, no raised voice, just a quiet decision. A moment when he no longer explains his pain, when he stops translating his soul into a language others refuse to understand. That's the moment masculine energy returns. Not with rage, but with restraint. Not with revenge, but with removal. Reclamation doesn't come with applause. It comes in silence, the kind of silence that holds weight, that creates distance not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. That says, without a word, I'm done begging to be respected. I'm done performing pain just to be seen. I'm done trying to make others comfortable with the truth that keeps me up at night. A man rebuilds by refusing to negotiate with what depletes him, not because he's cruel, but because he finally respects the voice he once silenced. He chooses himself, not as an act of ego, but as an act of survival. There was a man who walked away, not because he hated her, not because he wanted to win, but because he realized he could no longer betray his own presence to stay close to someone who no longer felt it. There's a discipline few speak about. It's called the boundary that needs no explanation. The no that doesn't come with a backstory. The line drawn without an argument. These are non-justified boundaries. They aren't loud, they aren't angry, they're sacred, and they're what reclaim a man's center. Marcus Aurelius said, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." That begins the moment you stop explaining your worth. The moment you let your silence speak for you, not because you've given up, but because you've finally remembered your own weight. She may never understand it. They may never applaud it, but that quiet decision, that sacred refusal, that is the point where the current returns, where the spine straightens, where the man who is always in you stops waiting to be seen and simply stands. You weren't robbed. You weren't overpowered. You weren't defeated in a single moment. What happened was slower, quieter, more invisible. You traded pieces of yourself, not for pleasure, not for peace, but for the illusion of safety. You gave away your center so the world wouldn't call you difficult. You dulled your edges so love wouldn't leave. You silenced your instincts so they'd keep smiling. And now, you stand in the wreckage, not of some disaster, but of your own absence. But here's the truth no one told you. What you gave away wasn't destroyed. It was scattered, buried beneath roles you never chose, words you never spoke, rooms you stayed in too long. The man you were isn't gone. He's just been waiting, watching, silent under the weight of survival. Zeno spoke of returning to virtue, not as a moral code, but as a return to structure, to alignment with your own nature. That's what masculine energy truly is. Not a performance, not a mask, but the quiet form of a man who knows who he is and no longer asks anyone for permission to be him. You don't have to rebuild everything. You only need to stop trading yourself for approval. You only need to stop apologizing for your presence. Because masculine energy isn't something you earn. It's what remains when you stop abandoning yourself. Seneca once wrote that the tree that survives winter isn't the tallest. It isn't the most beautiful. It's the one most rooted, the one that didn't move, the one that stood silently through the storm. So now ask yourself, what parts of you have been traded for peace that never came? What did you give up to avoid the fire, only to burn from the inside? The ship is not lost. The hull is broken. The pieces are scattered across moments you survived with a smile, but they're still yours. And when you gather them, not to become who you were, but to become who you refuse to betray, you won't need to speak. Your presence will say it all.